Hi, I'm James Whitmore. Together, we're stepping out of the present and into history itself. Walk with me through the cities, streets, and moments that shaped our world. This is James Reconstructs History. At the dawn of the 17th century, London was like a colossal organism rising from the mists, riddled with contradictions. The narrow streets of the Middle Ages were giving way to the first sparks of a global empire. The population was exploding. The number of inhabitants, which was 200,000 at the beginning of the 1600s, would exceed 1 million by the end of the century. London had become not just a city, but the beating heart of Europe. But this growth came at a price. Slums spilling out beyond the city walls, cars scraping against each other on narrow streets, and different languages heard at every corner. This was a center of opportunity as well as misery. The foundations of the East India Company were laid here, and ships, docking in the ports, unloaded the world's exotic spices and fabrics into this chaotic metropolis. If you were approaching London from the south at that time, there was only one monumental structure to greet you: Old London Bridge. The only stone bridge providing access to the city across the Thames. But to call it just a bridge would be an injustice to its magnificence. Built on 20 massive arches, this structure was like a neighborhood unto itself. Huge 7-story wooden buildings, suspended above the water, lined both sides of the bridge. So much so that you might not even realize you were on the river as you crossed it. It was like walking through a dark tunnel between houses with cantilevered roofs that blocked the sky. This was one of London's most prestigious trading hubs. Life on the bridge meant constant noise and risk. Luxury haberdashery, bookstores, and jewelers were located on the lower levels, while the merchants' families lived on the upper levels. But there was a dark side to this scene. On the great stone gate at the southern entrance to the bridge, the severed heads of traitors were displayed on spears. A silent and terrifying warning to anyone entering the city, reminding them of the king's power. The danger wasn't limited to the law. Horse-drawn carriages navigating the narrow passages were a constant threat to pedestrians. And fire was the greatest nightmare. The houses were so close together that a spark could turn the entire bridge into a tunnel of flames. Furthermore, the narrow passages starlings between the bridge's piers transformed the Thames' powerful current into a torrent. For inexperienced sailors, going under the bridge was tantamount to dancing with death. In the 1600s, the Thames was not just a body of water flowing through London, but the city's lifeline and main thoroughfare. While the streets were muddy, narrow, and teeming with thieves, the Thames was the address for safe and fast transportation. Thousands of watermen, water taxi drivers transported people from one bank to the other in their boats. And the river's surface resembled a forest of gigantic galleons, barges, and fishing boats. London's wealth floated on this water. The smells of coal, silk, and tobacco mingled with the salt of the water. During what is called the Little Ice Age, London winters were far harsher than they are today. The Thames froze completely in some years of the 1600s. However, Londoners viewed this not as a disaster, but as a celebration. Frost fairs were held on the river, tents were erected on the ice, oxen were roasted, and ice skating took place. In fact, in the winter of 1683, the ice was so thick that a whole street and shops formed in the middle of the river. This was the city's most unusual connection with the river. Time was not kind to this massive stone monument. By the 1750s, the houses on the bridge were a security threat. They obstructed traffic flow and weighed down the structure. In the 1760s, a radical
decision was made to demolish all the houses and attempt to modernize the bridge. But this was not enough. Faced with the speed of New London and the size of ships, this 600-year-old giant had grown weary. Until it was completely demolished in 1831 and replaced with a new bridge, Old London Bridge remained a silent witness to an era. Buckingham Palace, today the world's most famous palace, was just a house at the end of the 1600s. Built for the Duke of Buckingham, it was a peaceful manor house on the western edge of the city, surrounded by mulberry gardens. At that time, Whitehall was the center of the royal family. Buckingham was merely an aristocratic retreat. No one could have predicted that this brick building would one day become the unshakable symbol of the British Empire and monarchy. A small spark in a bakery on Pudding Lane turned into one of history's greatest catastrophes. Wooden houses, fanned by the wind, became torches. The fire raged for 4 days, consuming 13 houses and 87 churches. But from the ashes, a new London was born. Under the leadership of Sir Christopher Wren, narrow streets were widened, wooden buildings were banned, and the magnificent dome of St. Paul's Cathedral forever changed the city's skyline. Rising on the eastern edge of the city, this imposing fortress was London's feared and revered tower. In the 17th century, the Tower of London was more than just a palace. It housed the Mint, the Royal 200 and, most importantly, a prison where the state's most notorious enemies were held. The inscriptions on its walls bear the cries of the nobles awaiting their final hours here. But at the same time, the monarchy's greatest treasures were protected behind these armored walls. Cheapside was London's main shopping street and the heart of its parades. Grand ceremonies, such as Marie de Médicie's entry into the city in 1638, took place here. But beneath this ostentatious surface, anger simmered. The chasm between the poverty of the common people and the extravagance of the royalty was evident in Cheapside's crowds. This was the first place where whispers of the approaching civil war and social upheaval began to rise. To the west of London rose Westminster, the center of politics and spirit. In 1647, England was in the midst of a deep crisis. The conflict between King Charles I and Parliament had spilled into the streets. Westminster Hall, not only the place where laws were made, was about to become a court where a king would be tried. The city was divided in two, royalists and parliamentarians. The cold winds of civil war blew between the Gothic towers of Westminster Abbey. Westminster Pier was the gateway to royalty and power. If you were an important statesman or a foreign ambassador, you would arrive in the city not on horseback, but on a magnificent galley by the river. This pier was not just a stopover, it was a stage where political power and prestige were displayed. Whitehall, with its 1,500 rooms, was the largest palace in Europe and the heart of the English monarchy. All the intrigues, balls, and state decisions of the monarchy took place in these corridors. However, in 1649, an execution platform erected in front of this palace would change world history. King Charles I was executed in front of his own palace, in full view of the public. Just outside the city, on the riverbank, rose Richmond Palace. It was the Tudors' favorite summer residence. But with the death of Queen Elizabeth I here in 1603, an era came to an end. The golden age of the Tudors ended in the quiet rooms of Richmond. Today, walking among London's modern skyscrapers, it's difficult, but not impossible to see traces of the 1600s. The city's street plan still adheres to the boundaries drawn after the fire. The Thames still flows with the same force. The global trade ambitions of the 17th century laid the foundation for today's financial center. London learned in that century to rise from the ashes and become a stronger metropolis after every disaster.